Okay, so I wanted to address a question that I'd seen on Reddit. Somebody was talking about they were worried that they were brute force memorizing pieces or learning by brute force. They were using their ears to learn pieces to some degree, and they wanted to see how to not do that. Um, it's kind of complicated because they mentioned they were a beginner, and if you're a beginner, you can't avoid that. But it's really perceptive of them to realize that it's a problem long term to do this. Because the reason you can't do it as a beginner is because you have no technical fundamentals in place. So everything that you work on, you're going to be working on a piece of music and the technique involved in that 100% from scratch. So you'll have to repeat it so many times that you just will not be able to not memorize it because it's all completely new. So normally what I would say though is work on easier music. Just work on much, much, much easier music, like offensively easy, like way easier than you think. Um, and then it becomes something that you're not fighting through as many technical hurdles, and you can learn the piece of music before you memorize it. The thing that happens with a lot of people, even very advanced players, is that they have a piece memorized before they can even execute it technically. And that's a red flag. So I would say really focus on your technical skills. Make sure that you can play things like, your scales and your arpeggios, basic cadences, this kind of that stuff is very important. Um, because all those things are going to, if you have those things in place when you go to learn a piece of music, that piece of music won't be as hard for you. So, like an example would be something like Minuet in G, which I printed out and put in front of me. Right. So, why is that easy for me to play and read? I mean, for one, I have the reading skills to do that. It's also not technically beyond me, and I understand what's happening from a theory standpoint. But having all of that, and especially the technical skills, means that I am not going to struggle with the things a beginner would. I know what all these distances feel like. That's a fifth, and I know exactly how that feels when I get to the end of that line. I know that octave. I can find that. I'm not struggling to find it. I don't have to look at my hand to find it. Um, I can play these chords at the beginning, and I'm not struggling to hit the notes at the same time, which is something that a lot of beginners will have trouble with. I don't. I don't have trouble playing scales even. Um, like I have that controlled, but that's because I have practiced that not in this piece of music. I've actually never played this piece of music all the way through, honestly. Um, but I have practiced those technical skills in isolation. I have practiced my scales. I have practiced arpeggios, all kinds of other things. Those things are just skills that I can put into, I just execute on them when I see them in context in music. So make sure that your technical skills you're always working on those technical skills. The other thing I would say is reading skills. Um, and especially because the poster had mentioned using his ear to kind of know how things go, that is a big one that, man, I'm amazed at how many times I've seen, especially on Reddit, people who've been playing for 10 or 15 years and they suddenly go, I can't read rhythm at all. And it's largely because of the recital culture in piano, and the like, everything is focused on learning the hardest piece that you can learn, and you work on it for months at a time, and you never have to learn reading skills. You just listen to the recording and you copied it. You're not actually reading. So first of all, I would start by telling people to grab this book, Progressive Steps to Syncopation for the Modern Drummer. It's a drum book, but that doesn't matter. This is perfect for piano. It starts out very, very simple with just like quarter notes, right? So you have these quarter note patterns, and you have some rests, and it's in two hands. You just need to practice these between your hands, and then it gets more complicated. I'll hear some triplets and dotted eighths against quarter notes. That kind of compound rhythm is important. There's some sixteenths and stuff. here's some syncopations with rests. That's pretty complicated. If you can't read those rhythms without notes, if you can't just pat them on your lap, I normally advise people to pat them on their lap. You could just put them in 2 notes on the keyboard. Just pick 2 notes and whatever. But yeah, you can practice those everywhere. But you should be able to play those. If you can't read those rhythms by themselves, and then you add the extra layer of notes and pitches and fingerings on top of that on piano, man, you are just up a creek. It's going to be too hard. So make sure that you have that rhythm on lock. Like I feel like that's one of the big advantages that I have that I literally almost never think about when it comes to practicing sight reading. Like, rhythm is not a thing that I struggle with at all. I just have too much experience at this point. No rhythm is too complex. There are things that are hard for me to play and execute, but no rhythm is too complex for me to break apart. I understand how to subdivide it. So be able to do that. The next book that I think is really good for every beginner and pretty much anybody is this one, Progressive Sight Reading Exercises for Piano by Hannah Smith. These are really easy sight reading exercises. They start out crazy easily. It's all whole notes, right? And then, mostly half notes and stuff over here. Oh, we got some quarter notes. Now, here's the deal about this book is that a couple of things. Everything is in a 5-finger position. You'll never have notes that stretch to a 6th. Everything is going to be within 5 fingers. Now, it might be there, it might be here, it might be here, but it's always in a 5-finger position. And, people are going to think, oh, that's too easy. No, okay, fine. If you can just nail that book at a high tempo, all 500 plus exercises, sight reading effortlessly, fine. But, I always say, if you think something's too easy, prove it. Put your hands on the keys and prove it. It's an inexpensive book, and you absolutely should work through it. But, almost all the time, both hands are doing the same thing. So it's really simple. Yeah, that's easy, but can you read it? Can you get good at reading ahead? Because that's an important part of sight reading, is being able to read ahead while you're still playing. And it's almost always both hands together, and when it's not, it's always really simple stuff with mostly whole notes or half notes in the left hand. But if you can't sight read that, what hope do you have sight reading anything else? And I will say that one piece of advice, there are a lot of pieces of advice for sight reading that I think are terrible, but the one piece of advice I hate to see for sight reading is people will tell someone to go, oh, read easy familiar songs. No, do not do that. Don't do that. Because then you're running into the same problem. You're not reading rhythms that are actually difficult for you. You are relying on your ear. You're not reading the rhythm. This is something that I run into a lot. I've seen it a lot in beginner band situations. Because in a lot of beginner band books, they will have an arrangement of jingle bells all in unison for all the instruments. And the rhythm is da 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 da. But what do you think everybody plays? Da 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 da. They play the dotted 8th 16th. Now, it's not written that way in the book because they haven't introduced that rhythm yet, but the kids are playing what rhythm they know. They're not actually reading the rhythm, and that is the problem if you go try to read whatever you're familiar with, Christmas tunes, nursery rhymes, maybe hymns for some people will be too familiar. Simple hymns might be too simple. I think hymns are very difficult overall as a beginning sight reading thing. That's another piece of advice people give. Hymns are too complicated, but simplified hymn tunes, that's not a good place to go to read rhythm. So make sure you're reading things that are not familiar. And that's another reason the Hannah Smith book's great. It's 500 exercises. They're boring as shit. You're not going to memorize them. They're mostly 8 bars, sometimes 16 bars. And they're just not memorable. The thing that's great is you can just play through that book over and over from the start. And you're essentially sight reading every time because nothing's memorable. You will have to read the rhythms every time. You will have to read the notes every time, and you get good at reading. So I think that should be in everybody's daily routine for if they're a beginner, until the book really is so far below them that they need to work on other stuff. So work on your sight reading, work on your rhythm independently from all the other stuff, and make sure your technical skills are taken care of. I'm counting over here, but my hand's not high enough. Okay, so that's just the basics of how to make sure that you're not relying on this. And then obviously play easier music, incorporating all of those things. I will say that my rule of thumb for what music is in the best range for you, in sense of general development, my rule would be you should be able to sight read through it at least half tempo most of the way through. If you can sight read most of it at half tempo all the way through, that's in a perfect range for you to learn. If you're struggling to do that, it's probably beyond you. And then once again, the caveat that if you're an absolute beginner, there's almost nothing that's going to fall in that range. You just will have to do a certain amount of near brute force learning until you get good at reading the notes on the staff, reading rhythms. But those two books I recommended are a great way to work on those things independently and work up to that point. But learn lots of easy music. So the next strategy gets a little more complicated, and I would say start to set a deadline for yourself. Pick a piece of music, maybe using that little rule I mentioned, and give yourself 1 week to learn it. And that doesn't mean that, I've only got a week, so I have to cram 3 hours a day of practice in to get it ready in a week. You're not performing this. Nobody's paying you to do this. That's something I run into, and that sucks, and it's not a good way to practice. It's very inefficient practice. If nobody's paying you to do this, you don't want to practice that way with a hard performance deadline. Your goal, the reason you're setting this deadline is just, this is the deadline of when I'm going to move on from this piece. So I would actually say limit yourself within a day to how much time you can practice on it. Personally, I'll only spend 5 to 10 minutes on a section of music. You might bump that up to 30 minutes because if you're a beginner, you really are marrying the ideas of your technical skills and all of the learning the piece skills. Luckily I work on other instruments I suck at, like doing a lot of classical guitar right now, and I suck balls at it. So I get to feel what that's like to be terrible as an advanced musician still playing terribly. And so I have to work really hard. So I understand that if you're an absolute beginner, you might need 30 minutes, but try to not exceed that. And the point there is that if you limit yourself to 5, 10, 15, 30 minutes a day on any piece of music or a section of a piece of music, you don't have time to just beat it into your brain. So you can't get into that brute force place. You have to make yourself, you'll come back the next day and you'll sort of have forgotten it. Now, I think a lot of people think that that's a step backwards because they forgot it. Their muscle memory fell apart. No. During your practice session the previous day, you had loaded it into your short-term memory, you kind of buffered it, and you were playing off of that buffer, but you stopped flexing those skills of am I actively counting? Am I actively processing where is this note on the page in my hands? No, you stop doing all that. Once that's out of your buffer the next day, you have to work on it again. And that's the point. You want to work on it. It needs to be hard. You need to be actively working through that skill and thinking, okay, what note is that? That's an A. Okay, where's an A on the keyboard? Sure, it's a slow process in the beginning, and you have to go through that over and over and over, but you get a little bit more efficient at it every time you do it. So don't try to rely on muscle memory. Make yourself go through that step by step every time. Do that for a week on a piece of music. If you didn't finish it, fine. That was not the goal. The goal is not to finish the piece of music. The closer you can get to doing that, great, because you're learning how difficult of a piece of music can you learn in a certain amount of time, given a certain time constraint. Where is your level? What is something you can learn in a week with 30 minutes a day or less? But the goal isn't to finish it. The goal was all that practice, because the practice is what matters. It's all that hard processing in the middle that will make you better in the long term, and you will be able to learn more pieces of music more quickly because you're developing those skills. Learning how to play one song and you've spent 3 months on it, absolutely brute forcing it, congratulations, you don't play piano. You can play that one song, and the next song that you want to learn is going to take another 3 months if it's at the same level. But if you keep investing in all of your technical skills and your reading skills, Things that took you 3 months will take you 1 month. Things that took you 1 month will take you a week. Things that took you a week are going to be things you could learn in an hour if you can't just sight read them. So you just have to constantly be trying to find that sweet spot of practice and be, fixing all of those little weaknesses, all your technical weaknesses, all your reading weaknesses, stuff like that. Now, moving up maybe a tier from that in terms of difficulty, and really, if you're a beginner and you're okay with that, like 1 week deadline thing, you could try this too. Get 3 or 4 or 5 pieces and learn them all at the same time, and alternate days. This has that same effect. It's just kind of like on steroids. So now you're practicing that. You're practicing a piece, and then you're practicing the second piece the second day, and the third piece the third day. By the time you get back around, you've practiced 5 pieces, and it's been 6 days later, and you're getting back to the first piece. Man, you don't remember what the hell you were doing. So you have to go through that process again of like, I have to think about all these notes, and I have to do all this stuff, and you're starting from scratch. And like I said, that's the goal. You want that. And the better you can get at learning lots of different things, you're just in a better position. Overall, I would generally recommend people play, especially not necessarily at beginner level, because you need to make sure your technical fundamentals are in place before you get really complicated. But for people who are getting more advanced, intermediate advanced, what do these words even mean? But the more advanced you get, you want to do that thing where you're practicing on lots of pieces at once so that you can cover as many different styles as possible. Even if we're just sticking to pure classical, rather than working on, you could work on one piece of Bach for, a month or more. Well, does learning Bach make you any better at playing Chopin? It kind of doesn't. So what if you were learning a Bach piece, an easy Bach piece, and an easy Chopin piece? Those are very different styles, and they'll force you to work on different things in different ways, and that's really good. And I think you should expand that out beyond that into pop styles. Maybe learn a rag. That's kind of easy stuff. It's not easy stuff. That's easier, complex stuff. It's very technically difficult. Stride is technically difficult. But it's not quite to the level of like jazz or something like that, or really dense harmonies. But try to be playing in as many different styles as possible. But no, even for a beginner, maybe you don't want to go that deep into the style stuff, but play a variety of things over 3 or 4 or 5 days, and it just keeps making you work on all of those little muscles. It's the decoding muscles that you want to work on. So always be working on those, and you're just going to become a better, more capable musician. Your goal in the long run would be to be able to learn new music more quickly. Okay, so in closing, I'll just throw out one of the things I often like to say, is that you're not as good as the hardest piece of music you can play. And a lot of people think that that's the case. They think that is the measure of how good they are as a pianist. So let's say somebody can play La Campanella, and it took them 7 months to learn that piece. And there's somebody else who can play La Campanella, and it took them 2 months to learn that piece. Are those people at the same level? Like, no, obviously not. So I would say a better measure of how good you are as a musician is what's the hardest piece of music that you can learn in a week. And I think for hobbyists, that's going to be a more important skill for them anyway, because most people aren't going to go into music, and as adults, they're going to have less time to practice and play. So they want to invest in skills that let them just sit down and play, or learn pieces quickly so that they can enjoy playing the piano. And if your only approach to piano your whole life has been brute forcing a piece 3 hours a day for 3 months, you're probably going to stop playing piano as an adult, because there just won't be the time. And honestly, there won't be the audience. Like, it's depressing to people, but like the reality is, if you spent 3 months learning a piece of Chopin, by that time your spouse doesn't want to hear it because they've heard you like fracking your way through it for 3 months. They don't care when you can play it all the way through. They don't want to hear it. Your peers probably don't want to hear it. They're probably just not that interested. Just because you are really into classical music, they don't care, and they're not going to care that you spent 3 months on it. And that's crushing to a lot of people. It's so crushing to classical pianists to work really hard on a piece of music and nobody appreciates it, but that's the reality. So I would really insist that people who are wanting to play and want to play long term work on the skills that would let you learn to play a piece in a week, and learn to gauge that. You know, that part of those strategies I was mentioning are around gauging what you can learn in a week. Um, because that's probably going to be the level around which you'll be able to play as a hobbyist into your adulthood so that you can continue enjoying. Anyway, I'm going to close it there. I've been rambling for way too long.